What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 42 of the series, and this time I'm continuing a series that I started and have only done one episode so far. Way back in, I believe the video came out in May, but I think I recorded it back in March or something like that. I started with Percy Jackson. This week, I'm actually covering the Kane Chronicles by Rick Riordan, a kind of part of my desire to reread / read for the first time, all of the Rick Riordan stuff that I'm interested in covering in this sort of segment. Like I said, I have done one episode for this before that was covering, reviewing, and ranking the entire Percy Jackson and the Olympian series, which, honestly, short review for that, I think it holds up really well, even as YA series. I'm loving it as a kid. Rereading it again, I think there are lots of stuff about it that really hold up. So, compared to Percy Jackson, how does the King Chronicles hold up? That's what I'm going to be discussing in this video. Similar to the Percy Jackson one, in some essence, there's going to be a little bit of retrospective talk in this video, but not nearly so much as in that Percy Jackson video, because in the Percy Jackson series, I remembered a lot more than I didn't, all things considered. There were plenty of things that I had indeed forgotten, but there was a lot of it that I had not forgotten, a lot of it that was still forefront in my mind, different memories from different books, memories of experiences while reading the books, not even just scenes within the stories. King Chronicles is a lot different. There was pretty much nothing that I actually remembered about the series beforehand, and everything that I did actually remember for the most part was like little tiny snippets of scenes. When it came down to details or why or how those scenes occurred or anything like that, I didn't remember anything about those elements of this series. So that kind of goes a little bit into this first section of the video where I talk about what is my history with Kane Chronicles. Well, it's not quite as extensive as Percy Jackson. I don't need to go as in-depth into this section as I did in that video. You can go watch that video if you would like. That'll be up in, I believe, that corner, if I'm not mistaken. If not, it'll be that corner. We'll see. But I first read the Kane Chronicles in 5th grade, and I actually remember trying to reread them at one point in like 6th grade or something like that shortly afterwards, but I only got like 10% through book 1 when I tried rereading it initially. It just seemed like, as a series, this one is less, I'm not entirely sure how I want to word this. It seemed at the time when I tried to reread it that the series was not nearly so easy to get back into immediately as Percy Jackson was, where I have read Percy Jackson and the Olympians at least 3, but I'm pretty sure 4 times actually, and the Heroes of Olympus at least 2 times, but I'm pretty sure 3. The King Chronicles was one that I read once, forgot most of, and when I did try to reread it, couldn't, and I'm not entirely sure why that was, but that's just kind of how things went at the time. And sorry about the glare in my glasses on this video. I'm trying to keep my head, looking this direction so that there's less of it. For whatever reason, without the sun, there's ironically more background lighting coming through my window that's affecting the way that it looks on my glasses. So again, I apologize for that. But let's get into some of the rules for discussion for this video. Now, it was a little bit more extensive, this section as well, in my Percy Jackson video, because the rules in this video are going to essentially be the same as in that one. I will be keeping this as spoiler-free as possible, so I will be reviewing the whole trilogy, but I'm not going to go into plot spoilers or anything like that. So if you haven't read the trilogy yet, you're somebody who enjoys Rick Riordan, hasn't read King Chronicles yet, because there are plenty of people like that, or if you're somebody who just hasn't read any Rick Riordan and maybe wants to see what all the fuss is about for whatever reason, you can watch this video safely. So without further ado, let's actually get into the reviews. Starting off, obviously, with the first book in the trilogy being The Red Pyramid. Now, this is actually the biggest book of the trilogy. It's over 500 pages, where book 2 is 440 or something, and then book 3 is barely over 400. So, surprisingly, the first book is the longest. That's not something that you often see. I think that The Red Pyramid is a super solid start to this trilogy as a whole. It stands on its own very well without reducing its own role in the trilogy. So what I mean by this is that it has its own plot and its own antagonist and its own conflicts that make it a single book that is able to, in essence, pretty much be read on its own without requiring you to read the rest of the trilogy. It's resolved very well, all of these self contained arcs, but all throughout it also hints at what is to come in the trilogy as a whole, what the overarching plot for the entire trilogy is going to be, and obviously makes you want to read the rest of the trilogy, but to a certain small degree, you could technically read this first book and have its own arc be fully satisfying, even if you're not getting the entire arc of the trilogy. It's worth reading the whole trilogy, obviously. Another thing that I really liked about the book is that the characterization for it being a YA book, and especially with two protagonists, is that the characterization is, not gonna lie, it's actually surprisingly good, particularly among those two protagonists that I mentioned. Carter and Sadie Kane are both narrators for the book, and both of them are in first person, which is actually a somewhat strange and, uh, yeah, I'll say strange writing decision. I don't know how many books I have read that have more than one narrator that are all first person. I know the Lorien Legacies series does that, another YA series that I really enjoy, but there aren't a whole lot of them. And I think it's because having a unique voice for the narration of the entire story, not just with dialogue between characters, I think is going to be a little bit more challenging if all of your narrators are first person. But I greatly respect that decision. Carter and Sadie have very distinct voices that honestly work splendidly with how the framing device of the story is written, with these being after the events of the stories, the narrator's recording into a microphone, onto a, some sort of recording device. I'm not actually sure I recall what type, being sent the recordings to Rick Riordan as the author of the stories. That's the framing device, and I think that having the two distinct voices is honestly a really fun way to do that kind of storytelling. There are slightly different mannerisms and vocabulary used between those two protagonists, depending on which one is narrating which sections, and that also went a pretty decent way in making it more fun for me to read, which could subconsciously also work wonders for the intended YA audience in, obviously distinguishing between the narrators, but also being able to go back and forth and enjoy that sort of thing that comes with it. In some sense, I would also say that the imagery of this book is, I mean, iconic's not necessarily the right word, but there was something about it that just stood out in my mind so well from when I read it at first, because there was so much that I had forgotten about this series and this book when I had first read it that, I basically didn't remember any of it. When I started reading the book, I was just like, I don't remember pretty much anything. I remember like a handful of snippets from a handful of scenes, and that's like it. But somehow, while doing my reread, the very same visual images popped into my head while reading it, like in terms of my imagination of scenery and the events that play out, as happened when I read it for the first time in fifth grade. The how that was able to happen, I'm actually not entirely sure. It's kind of weird and creepy to me that that happened, but it did, and I think it's honestly kind of cool. Like I said, it's not necessarily iconic imagery, but it's definitely very memorable to me, because if I'm reading a story for the second time years later, having forgotten pretty much everything about the story, the fact that I'm imagining all the same stuff is a little bit crazy. I've reread other books, including Percy Jackson, and most of the imagery that I imagined while reading the story was very different than the first time I read it, even the second time I read it. Like, every time that I've read Percy Jackson, my imagery has been slightly different based on different criteria. This one, pretty much all exactly the same somehow. I don't know how that happened. It was like deja vu while reading, and that was honestly kind of really cool. I also like how, in some sense, you can tell immediately as well how much more epic in scope to some extent that the Kane Chronicles will end up being compared to the Percy Jackson series. Now, I mentioned in the review for the Percy Jackson series that the first couple of books feel kind of episodic in their format and in their writing that kind of separates them to some extent. There's some stuff going on between them that are building up to an overarching plot, and obviously there are many elements, even in the second book, which I think is the weakest of that series, that very clearly build up to what's going to happen at the end. But to some degree, those first couple books still manage to feel like they're winging it to at least some small extent. Like, Riordan was still trying to finalize what the rest of the series was going to be. It wasn't until book 3 that the true building up for the end of the series was happening to a full capacity that I thought was flawless. Like, oh, I very clearly see where this series is going now, while reading book 3, where book 2 was still like, okay, well, there's this stuff happening in this book, and it's got its own arc, and that's fine, but I'm still not sure what it's trying to lead up to. There were some elements of it that were trying to do that, but you didn't know how or why. In this series, a lot of that starts to happen already in book 1, and it's simultaneously done both more blatantly and more suddenly. That's not the word that I wanted to say. It's simultaneously done more blatantly and more subtly, with the balance between those, those sides of that being honestly pretty perfect. I don't know how Riordan was able to do it, but like I said, this whole book has its own arc, has its own plot, has its own self-contained story stuff happening, but it is hinting all throughout exactly what is probably going to be happening in the third book as a finale, as a climax, the overarching conflict that's going to happen at the end of the series. But even throughout, there are little hint drops that happen throughout that are like, okay, so this is probably something that's going to be the arc in book 2, and this is probably going to be the arc in book 3, and this is probably going to be the climax. He manages to do a lot of that already in the first book of this series, and that obviously comes with experience and having already had stuff planned out probably ahead of time before he started writing all this stuff while he was still finishing Percy Jackson. I'm very happy with the way that was able to turn out in this series. The only thing that I can say that I really disliked about this book was that following Percy Jackson, I think it became too apparent. I noticed too many times when Riordan relies on dreams or similar type of omnipresent-esque narrative devices that are able to make the main characters of the story aware, and thus making the audience aware of what's going on with the antagonists. Now, I can mostly forgive this because of a couple reasons. Firstly, it makes things a little bit easier to understand and put together for younger readers. It's not something that I ever really noticed blatantly or, would have pointed out when I was younger reading this series, or even that I would have pointed out while reading Percy Jackson, compared to when I reviewed Percy Jackson before, where I mentioned that he does use that quite a bit. In this series, I actually don't recall it being used horribly often in the rest of the books, but this first book uses it quite a lot. Now, the other reason that I can forgive it is also because it's kind of hard to find other ways to do this kind of, making the audience especially aware of what's going on in the background besides just the main characters in a first-person narrative, and dreams are kind of an easy way to do that. So like I said, I can mostly forgive it for this, but it's probably the only thing that I can complain about in this book. There are several of these dreamlike narrative devices. Now, they're unique to the concept of the story being Egyptian mythology, which is fun, but yeah, it happens a little bit too often in Riordan's writings. And that concludes my general review of The Red Pyramid. I know I've talked a lot about it. Hopefully, these sections on these next two books will be a little bit shorter. So obviously, we're going to move on to book 2 of the trilogy, being The Throne of Fire. Now, this one, I think it's a little bit more messy. It's definitely the weakest of the trilogy. To some degree, it also suffers from that middle book syndrome that a lot of trilogies tend to have some of in book 2. At the same time, I still think the book is very worthy. Its primary arc throughout is building up to gaining the power and the devices necessary for the third book to be able to exist. So obviously, it's still a necessary entry in the trilogy. Like, I'm not going to say that skip the second book. I'm never going to do that kind of thing. That's a dumb thing to recommend. But to some degree, there are some books and some series that people are just like, well, most of this could have been skipped. I don't think any of the material in book 2 could have been skipped. It just wasn't executed as well as the first book was, in my opinion. Now, there are still some great character moments, very important interactions between them that pay off super amazing in the final book as well. But the book the book's individual arc is definitely a little bit more of a middle book syndrome thing, like I mentioned. It still stands on its own well enough, but not as well as even the other two books do. The arc of this book is very clearly a build up to what is supposed to be coming in book 3, so it doesn't feel self contained as well. Now, if the entire trilogy was meant to be one story that was split into 3 volumes for some reason, similar to like The Lord of the Rings or even some other books, like Book of the New Sun, I've heard is split because of a similar thing like that, I wouldn't complain as much about it because when a story is meant to be one full thing and then it's split into multiple volumes, you have to find somewhere to split it. And sometimes, oftentimes, those splits don't always come, in the best of places. This trilogy was very obviously written for these splits to occur where they were on purpose, but but because book 1 stands alone on its own so well compared to this book, it feels a little bit weird to read this book and have it very clearly be part of the trilogy rather than trying to be, its own thing. And especially when you compare this to Percy Jackson as well, where all 5 books, even though they all build on each other and you cannot read any one of them without having read the previous ones, to some degree, they all have their own thing going on. It's somewhat episodic in the way that Harry Potter is, or at least the way that I've been informed Harry Potter is, because no, I haven't read that yet either. What I'm basically trying to say is the Throne of Fire is not self contained enough for it to feel wholly satisfying in itself. The most satisfying parts of book 2 in this trilogy actually come in book 3 as their payoff. And that's a little bit weird. So, yeah, like I said, it's a little bit messy because of that. I think my biggest complaint with the Throne of Fire actually comes with the beginning of the book, especially the intro sequence, because it's kind of abrupt, and because of that abruptness, lacks a sense of tension. Now, there's nowhere near enough time to bond with a bunch of new characters that exist during the beginning of this book, so bad things happening, disaster striking, as they tend to happen in the Rick Riordan sense, doesn't mean nearly as much as I think it should in the beginning of this book, because like I said, there's a bunch of new characters here that weren't in the Red Pyramid that you come to grow close to and like through the course of this book, but because they're there in the intro scene, when certain things happen in the intro scene, like I said, there's a lack of tension because you don't know these characters, so you don't really care what happens to them to some extent. You can care about them through Carter and or Sadie as the narrators, but there's, like I said, it's a little bit messy in that sense. Similarly, my next complaint about the book is I think the climax was strangely underwhelming to some extent, and in some way it's also due to a lack of tension. Not quite as much as the beginning of the book, but in some sense there is that lack of tension. It's justified in its form of existence to allow for book 3 to be able to happen and to soar to such heights as it does, but there is a definite lack of finality to the climax of this book that makes it feel weird to end the book on. I don't know why that is. Like, I can't actually like analyze it and be like, this is why it feels off, but for some reason it just feels off for me. However, with those two complaints laid out before you, I will say, conversely, that the middle portions of this book, Act 2, all of the rising action, is amazing. Riordan always has something happening in the middle of this book, always new scenes with new conflicts, new stuff going on. It's chock full of this stuff, moments of action that, it's just really good. He's able to do this with most of his books in a way that I find really splendid. He never runs out of ideas for things to just have happen to the narrators as pacing and as, beats to move the story forward, to move the characters forward in what they're supposed to be doing. He's really good at this. This book is no different. The middle portion, very, very good in this book, despite the beginning and end being a little bit underwhelming to me. But I will actually go into the biggest complaint about this book, and that being that you know, the beginning and the finale being a little bit underwhelming, I can forgive. It's just part of the way that the book and the series as a whole is structured. So even though it's not quite up to snuff with the first book or even the next book, it's still fine. I can forgive it for, how it was structured. The main complaint about this book is that Sadie's romantic subplot compared to Carter's, well, Sadie's romantic problems get very overbearing pretty quickly. It relies a bit too much on the dreaded YA love triangle type of trope that a lot of people hate, which, while I never really understood it to some degree because I hadn't encountered it very often in, my recent growing back into loving reading, I definitely see why it can be a problem for some people, because in this book, this book has a little bit of it that's just like, okay, can we not have to listen to Sadie complain about this stuff all the time? Like, please, can we just move on? So it does get a little bit overbearing, but even this biggest problem with this book, and honestly the trilogy as a whole, it is easily the worst element of the entire trilogy. Even this pays off to some extent in book 3. It gives it a satisfying conclusion that makes me less inclined to hate it, but in the process of reading it throughout this second book, it is a little bit much. And with all that being said, now that this video is running on super long, apologize for that, let's finally talk about this third book, The Serpent's Shadow. Now, this book is almost perfect to me. In nearly all ways, it is a perfect finale. I've mentioned that Riordan is really good at doing action-packed stuff and having stuff happen throughout a book in rising action to move the plot and move the characters forward in what they're supposed to be doing. This is an even better example of what Riordan is able to do, both in that and also in terms of wrapping things up. Riordan is masterful, in my opinion, at being able to coherently tie together pretty much all of the threads that are happening through a book, and in this case, a series, leaving very little out. What he does leave out as loose ends in this book throughout the trilogy is obviously very intentionally left as loose ends. He never forgets to tie together loose ends that need to be tied together. If it doesn't absolutely need to be, he'll sometimes intentionally leave those undone so that you'll be interested in reading a different series of his, or, thinking about some of the ramifications of those things. And that's very nice to have pretty much everything wrapped up and the stuff that's not wrapped up not be super important. That's just like, okay, well, why wasn't that taken care of? I really love that Riordan was able to do that in this trilogy so well. He also rarely leaves things forgotten. What I mean by this is that certain things can happen, certain physical objects will be brought up in earlier books in the series, or even earlier within the same book, that will serve little to no purpose at the time that you'll notice and pretty much be completely forgotten by readers, just to be brought back up in this final book. Maybe not necessarily in the climax of the final book, but in the final book to some degree, that is just like, oh, that was important. And it'll be somehow very surprising, but also very satisfying at the same time. And it is just brilliant. Now, going on to some of the more structural stuff, since that's what I've talked about in the first 2 books as well, I mentioned in The Throne of Fire that the beginning and end are slightly underwhelming compared to how good the rising action is. I would say that The Serpent's Shadow almost has the opposite problem. Now, the beginning and the ultimate finale to the book are absolutely brilliant, like perfect. I love them so much. While the middle sections weren't quite as good as the beginning and end of it, but that's not to say that they're bad at all. I still think the rising action in The Serpent's Shadow was as good as the rising action in The Throne of Fire. It was just that the beginning and the end were so good to, overtop them pretty easily. The stakes in The Serpent's Shadow just feel so perfect the entire way through. Even Sadie's romantic subplot in book 2, ultimately the worst part of that book and the series, isn't so egregious in this book, and like I said, is also wrapped up in its own way that I think is still fun and interesting as far as love triangle subplots and annoyances go. Most love triangle subplots that I'm aware of don't really go anywhere satisfying. It's just a headache throughout the process, and then when it's done, it's just like, oh, well, thank goodness that's over. I never want to read that again. In this one, it's like, well, thank goodness it's over. I never want to read this again. But it's also like, okay, well, there was actually a reason for that to exist. Even if it doesn't make it more enjoyable to read at the time, you'd see there's a reason for it to exist. And then I'm personally not as mad at it, like I said. The only complaint that I have with this book actually doesn't come in terms of the story. The copy editing of The Serpent's Shadow it's rough, dude. There are dozens of omitted words that just that aren't there when they need to be there in the sentence. And it's just like, well, why in the world is that a thing? That wasn't a problem in the first two books. I think it might have been a problem in the back half of the Throne of Fire, but I don't remember because I read the Throne of Fire and the Serpent's Shadow back to back. But this book had dozens of omitted words that legitimately distracted my reading in places. It was like, why is it so frequent? I was getting pretty sick of it. And it's not even like the normal thing where plenty of Rick Riordan books will have copy editing problems in the last 100 pages of the book or something like that, just a handful of them sprinkled out throughout the, not even that many, like a few of them sprinkled out in the very end of the book where the copy editor just kind of was getting tired or something, I guess. But this one, it's throughout the entire book. It is really consistent. I don't understand how the copy editing could be so bad. There was even a couple sentences somewhere in the book that I legit could not make out what those sentences were supposed to be trying to say because the grammar and the structure, all of it was so messed up. It was like, how does a copy editor not fix this? So, copy editing was bad, but in terms of the story, there's nothing to complain about. So even though the copy editing problems are really distracting in places, the quality of the story itself is so good for me to forgive that, even if it's dumb for that to be a problem, especially in, relatively speaking, one of its shorter books. So now let's come into the final portion of the video where I'm actually talking about these books, being the spoiler-free ranking, and I don't know why I mentioned spoiler-free. The entire review is spoiler-free. But in terms of ranking these books from least favorite to favorite is going to be pretty quick and easy. I think might have made it clear, at least for this third option. At number 3, The Throne of Fire is easily the weakest book. It's not a bad book, but definitely the weakest in the trilogy. It has the least polish overall in terms of the story. We were talking, grammar and writing polish. Serpent Shadow is the worst one of the three, but in terms of story polish, this one is the worst and has the worst element of the series to the worst degree. Now, number 2, I think it was a toss-up deciding which one was my second favorite and which one was my favorite, but I think to some degree I have to put the Serpent's Shadow at number 2. For some reason, just the Sadie's love triangle type of problems, even though it's not super overbearing in this compared to the Throne of Fire, it still exists to some extent here. So even though it's wrapped up satisfyingly, that by itself is enough for me to be like, even though the rest of this book is pretty much perfect, without that subplot, it would be easily number 1 of these 3, but everything else was so perfectly wrapped up, I have to be like, well, it's number 2, but just barely because that one tiny thing, because the Red Pyramid is probably... it's the best of the 3. I think the Serpent's Shadow might be my favorite just because of how well it wrapped things up, but in terms of quality, the Red Pyramid's the best. It's such a solid start to the series, and it builds its own arc and resolves it really well while also foreshadowing for the rest of the series effectively. So that's how I would rank the 3 books. But now let's get into the conclusion. Sorry for making this video run long. Overall, I'm shocked at how little of this series I actually remembered from reading it in middle school, but I'm glad I did take the chance to reread it though. It was genuinely highly enjoyable to be able to read the series again, especially in the midst of a time period where I had either read a lot of really mediocre stuff. In July and August, I either read throughout the summer pretty much, I either read a lot of 3-star books, or I had a reading slump in July and August that occurred. So in the midst of this kind of time period when I was reading this, it was right after I read a bunch of mediocre stuff and had a short reading slump. So to have something that was so short and easy and fun and simple, quite frankly, did wonders on my reading. So I cannot wait to reread The Heroes of Olympus next year, being the sequel series to Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and I'm very glad I didn't ultimately have to push this reread into next year because of timing problems. Now, I've been reading a heck of a lot the past couple months, and have kind of had to be able to read everything that I want to read. Probably going to slow it down in 2023, but I am glad I decided to push through and finish this trilogy this year instead of pushing it into next year. If you're a Riordan fan, let me know if you've read the series. Let me know how you felt about it in the comments down below. I would love to hear about that. Do you think it compares to Percy Jackson in any way? In a plot sense, I think I personally enjoy both series pretty much equally. if it weren't for the love triangle stuff, I honestly think this series would probably surpass Percy Jackson and the Olympians in some regards for me. So let me know how you feel about this trilogy and how it compares to Percy Jackson. I'll see you all next week as I cover one of the only classics I'm ever going to cover on the Book Binge, that being the Iliad, which is, if you're a fan of Rick Riordan, the Iliad's going to be rather important, having some of that ancient Greek, basis for some of the knowledge that we have. I'll see you all again next week to be able to cover the Iliad. I'm really excited to talk about that one, so I hope you all come back around then.